Hello everyone and welcome to Deploying AI and Machine Learning in Production. My name is T. Scott Clendaniel and I will be guiding you through today's presentation and I hope you enjoy it. The first thing we're going to cover on this topic is what are we trying to accomplish with deploying models in production and why is this an issue? And it basically comes down to something that I refer to as the AI gap. If you take a look at all of the promise of artificial intelligence, you would think that most AI projects are a complete success. And why wouldn't you? The press is nonstop advocating for how successful they are. But then you start to see some different views on the topic, including from Venture Beat. Why do 87% of data science projects never make it into production? And that's from July 19th of 2019, so not all that long ago. So you stop to think for a minute, what type of industries or processes could be successful over the long term if they only have a 13% success rate? You're much more likely to create an AI model that doesn't go anywhere, that doesn't actually make it to production. But this isn't an observation just by Venture Beat. You can also take a look at the Gartner research. Why does Gartner predict that up to 85% of all AI projects, quote, do not deliver, end quote, for chief intelligence officers? Well, this is kind of startling. This means that projects that are not just models specifically, but for example, other type of analysis or text-based projects, NLP, that you might look into, they don't seem to be making it for CIOs. So how is it possible that we have all of this promise of artificial intelligence, but we don't seem to be having so much success? What's going on, and how are we going to fix that? Remember, artificial intelligence in history has already had two separate occasions on what they call an AI winter, meaning that the promise of AI basically went dormant for periods as long as decades in terms of no seeming forward movement in industry. And if you start to see statistics like this, whether you want to use the Venture Beat 87% number or the Gartner 85% number, that failure rate is pretty horrific and fairly consistent between the two studies. If you've had an AI winner before because you haven't had success, it's increasingly likely you may run into that again. Excuse me. So let's take a look at what actually causes deployment success, and how are we going to bridge the gap across that AI divide? So we have several different things going on here on this one slide, and I apologize for that. But I'm going to walk you through it step by step, and I think it'll start to make sense. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see a 5-step value chain for AI success, where you go from data all the way to organizational values. And it's a pretty logical set of 5 steps. First, you have data. Second, you have analysis of that data. Third, you have insights that come out of the analysis you performed on the data. But then you'll see the last 2 boxes, which are surrounded by this red box here with the big red arrow. You've got action and value. And the reason why I highlighted those is you can have all of the insights in the world that you want. But if the organization doesn't take action, there's no way to achieve value. And if you don't achieve value, why are you doing the projects in the first place? So these last 2 boxes in terms of action and value are really critical. And a lot of organizations and AI departments seem to be less concerned with these last 2 boxes and more concerned with the first 3 boxes. The problem for that, of course, is unless you take the action, you don't get to the value. If you don't get to the value, there's no purpose in having the project in the first place. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out on this slide. The second graphic I'm going to refer to is over on the right in the blue circle diagram, in terms of the 8 steps that SAS laid out in terms of how an AI project is supposed to function. They start with 1, identify and formulate the problem. 2, data preparation. 3, data exploration. 4, transformation and selection. 5, build the model. 6, validate the model. And then the last 2 steps are deploy the model and evaluate and monitor the results. All right, well, this ties right back to what we were talking about up in the upper right-hand corner. You need to get to deploying the model and evaluating the results. Those are the action steps if you're going to get to the value. So therefore, you can see pretty quickly that deploying the model is critical. You're not going to get any type of results for the organization you're trying to accomplish if you don't sort of follow all these steps in between. And the deployment of the model, if you're failing 85% or 87% of the time, is really going to cause you big troubles. Now, if you look over on the left-hand side, it just explains how the graphics on the right were determined. And then the core stages of the process down in this lower left-hand side, again, deploy the models, evaluate the results to be able to get. All right, so if we're going to bridge the gap, or I should say, for us to be able to achieve success, we've got to be able to bridge this deployment gap. All right, so what I've done is I've tried to put together some really highly actionable AI deployment tips that you can use on your organizational project to avoid that gap and to be able to achieve some of the results that AI has the promise for. They are numbered, but they're not in any particular order. Tip number 1, begin with the end in mind. And please forgive me, this sounds so consultant-y, if I can make that word up, that I can barely stand myself, and I get it. But it's really important, and it's a step that a lot of practitioners in our field seem to skip over. So, for example, if you look at The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey, if you'll remember from the 80s, this was the best-selling business book of all time up until that point. He had 7 different habits that he wanted you to be able to achieve to be an overall effective manager and leader. The second tip was begin with the end in mind. And all that means is, why are you building your AI model in the first place? So for our situation, out of all 7 of these steps, what is it we're trying to accomplish? Why are we building an NLP model? What are we going to do with the data that comes out of that text-based approach? Or alternatively, if we're building a fraud model, how are we going to use it? How are we going to get the value back out of it? If we haven't thought that through, we have no business doing all sorts of analyses and setting up our test models, which is really fun, and doing all those types of activities if we don't know what we need to get out of it from the end. So you need to start with this step. You can't go into diving into the data and coming up with all type of analyses only at the end to figure out, oh gee, looks like I'm solving the wrong problem. You have to start with what the objective is right from the beginning. Tip number 2. Identify your stakeholders' needs and goals. Now, I realize that this does require interaction with a lot of folks, and people are going to have different opinions. But remember, the hidden secret of AI is that models are about people, not about technology. Again, I get it. It sounds really consultanty. It sounds really sort of way out there and a little bit woo-woo, meaning it doesn't really sound like an AI approach. But remember, you've got all kinds of folks who are going to have a stake in your model. You've got regulators, community groups, local authorities, contractors, suppliers, environmental partners, customers, employees, investors, media. Who are all of these folks and what do they need out of the model? If you haven't figured out what their stake in being a stakeholder is, there's a really good chance that you're going to miss something that's important to them. And they can block your model from going into practice. So remember, this isn't just about technology and how we're going to implement it and whether we're going to use SageMaker or not. It's about making sure that everybody's needs are identified and met. Tip number 3, identify the model and project constraints. Now, going back to what I just said before, once you understand what everyone's needs are, realize that they're going to put constraints on your project. So, for example, let's say you're doing a fraud model and you figure out that your model does best within the top 7 deciles. Well, that's great, but let's say that you've got an operational group inside your current organization who can only follow up on 2% of the total number of records you flag for them. Well, if your model is optimized at 70%, you have a real challenge here because that means you have not squeezed all of the top prospects into that top 2% that can actually be followed up on. So the gap between the 2% and the 70%, The model is wasting effort in trying to come up with scores for people that they can never follow up on in the end of the process. You haven't taken the needs from step 2 and then developed the constraints that belong in step 3. So you have to make sure that these pieces are working together. A really simple one, cost. How much time do you have to be able to build the model, and how much is it going to cost in terms of your internal resources to build the model? And what is the benefit? If it turns out that you're going to have a very short time window or a very short cost ramp, you're going to have to reduce the amount of effort you put into the model before you come out the other side. If you don't, you're going to create a model that's never going to reach production because it's either too expensive to use or takes too long to get any value from. Tip number 4, the phase gate approach. Now, I'm going to use a silly example for a specific reason here. There used to be a whole series of reality TV shows where they would take folks and they would go and they do these massive makeovers on them, and they would change their diet, they would change their dress, they give them a new hairstyle. In case of some of the ladies, they would go ahead and they would change the makeup that was used on the individual folks. You'd have all of these different constraints that were going on, and then at the very end you would have the big reveal. So the big reveal was when they finally released the results, and they finally showed you the before and after photos that everybody seemed to be watching the shows for. The problem is that might work great on a reality show. It doesn't work so well for models, because there are a lot of folks who want to go off and they want to build their artificial intelligence models, and then they want to come and they want to show it to the stakeholders. Well, the problem is you can end up spending a lot of time and effort and find out that somewhere along the way something went wrong, and you're going to have to go all the way back to the beginning. One of the big challenges with AI projects and models in particular is the fact that things change so often, you can end up building a model for a problem that no longer exists. So you have to make sure that you're always doing check-ins with your individual stakeholders. And the way to do that is to steal something from the field of product development and project management. In product development, they have routine check-ins that they refer to as gates. So the first check-in is gate 1, second check-in is gate 2, etc. and so forth. And what happens is, at each one of these stages, at any of the gates in the process, they can stop and say, you know what, I don't think this is really going to work for us anymore, or we've got this new data set that we need you to take a look at, or oh, it turns out that the folks in IT are not going to be able to implement it using the original setup that we created. So very similar to an agile approach, use phased gates to check in with your stakeholders at multiple different points along the way and put the model into place that way rather than trying to do the big reveal at the end. Tip number 5, plan for obsolescence. This is a really important one. If you go through any set of modeling over a long period of time, you're going to realize that models have drift or decay over time. And yet so many folks who build models don't bake this in, so to speak, into the process. When are you going to recheck the model? When are you going to check the performance? What type of schedule do you have set up? Are you using a population stability report to see if things are changing? You should assume that your model is going to become obsolete and plan for it appropriately so that you have it in the schedule when the model is going to be rebuilt and not have it be a sudden revelation to folks on the project. Tip number 6, plan around the analytics maturity model. Now this again comes from Gartner, where they have identified 5 different levels on the AI maturity model. Basically, how is your organization using AI today? Are you still at a level 1 of awareness in terms of modeling? Or are you level 5, transformational? AI is part of the business DNA. Why is this important? Well, if you're way down here in the awareness stage, you're going to have a much bigger focus on explainable AI. You're going to have a much bigger focus on implementing models that are very robust and very easy to change and easy to monitor. You're not going to want to do something too complex. So if you think of this as sort of a progression from crawl, walk, run, if your organization is the crawl stage, don't use the Usain Bolt sprinting solution for your organization. Start out with something similar. Get some quick wins in. Make sure that your production process is adapted around your maturity model, or you're going to end up creating a solution that your organization can't put into place. Tip number 7. One of the things that you're going to need to realize is that organizations have different tolerances for models. So go back to the maturity model for a minute. You need to get buy-in. You need to establish trust. You need to make sure that everyone is aware of what's going on and they feel comfortable. One way to do that is to have what I call validation overkill. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and measure everywhere. Now, down here below, I have a 7-step model, which is probably really overkill for what most people need. But it is better to plan on doing too much validation than too little to be able to get your model into place. Tip number 8. Remember, make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. There is a desire among many of my colleagues to be able to create the most sophisticated, the most advanced, the most complex algorithm that anyone has ever seen before. The problem is that things that are more complex tend to break more often. This is a really bad idea, and one of the reasons why models don't make it to production. They're too complicated. They're more likely to break. People don't understand them. So keep them as simple and flexible as possible. Number 9, create a champion-challenger testing approach. Now this has to do with, let's say in today's world we already have a model, and it's model A, and we want to introduce model B. Make sure that you've got an overlap period, much like where you can compare the results of 2 different models before you put one into place over the other. Test them side by side on the same data over a period of time. Make sure that they're actually in place and they're functioning correctly before you replace model A. This is going to save a lot of heartache, and it also builds up a lot of trust in the process. Last, tip 10. What is your undo plan? Let's say for purposes of model that you've taken all these steps and you put the model in place, and for whatever reason, someday, someone comes to you and says, you know what, we can't use the model anymore, there's a big problem, we need to fix things. Do you have a plan to undo the model that you just put in place? You should have thought about this before you put the first model into place in the first place, before your implementation. Because if something goes wrong, you may need to get it out of there in a hurry. Make sure that you have that plan in place up front and communicate it to all the stakeholders for 2 reasons. 1, so everyone knows how to fix it in case there's a problem. And 2, it also provides peace of mind for them as they go through your process, and they're much less likely to run into unforeseen circumstances. Okay, that's everything. Thanks.